Hi, welcome back to the Get to Know Me show.
Welcome back to another episode of the Get to Know Me show. Now today is a very special day because the guest that I have is going to talk about the genocide against the Tutsi that happened in Rwanda in 1994. Now I want you to stay tuned because there's a lot of things that we're about to learn. Victor, how are you?
I'm doing well, Tanya. Thank you for having me.
And how are you holding up in this pandemic time that we're in?
Actually, not too bad. Considering everything that's happening, I'm doing well.
All right, great to hear. Now, I want to ask you the first question that's been on my mind for quite a while is, and I want our listeners to know this, tell us about or your opinion on why the genocide came to meet Rwanda specifically.
Okay, thank you for asking me. So I'm not really an expert when it comes to this issue, but I've read a lot about it, and it's something that I've accumulated a lot of knowledge about. And but I would highly encourage everyone that's watching to look up the website for the Kigali Genocide Memorial if they want to get to know more, because I don't know everything, and I constantly go back to the website to constantly just be learning something new, and they're updating the website a lot. And but to answer your question, so this all roots in the way Africa was colonized, not just Rwanda. A lot of Africa, I think there are only 2 countries in Africa that weren't colonized. And before colonization happened, there were explorers from Europe that came to Africa, and they just explored every part of Africa. And the sad thing is that as they were exploring, a lot of it, when they went back to their countries, they didn't really speak from the perspective of the people who lived in Africa. They usually just wrote what they thought about the people in Africa. And one of those people was John Speke, who was an English explorer. And when he was writing about Rwanda particularly, he noted down the difference between the people he had seen there, because some of them were taller and had straighter nose, and others were shorter. So he concluded that the taller and straighter nosed people came from somewhere else that was not Rwanda. But to quote one of my favorite Rwandan scholars, his name is Father Bernardin Muzungu, and basically what he says is that pre-colonial Rwanda thought everyone was the same. They really did not think that if you were tall, because they literally thought that everyone in the world was black that looked like them. So he likes to joke around and say that they thought Adam and Eve were black. If they had known of Adam and Eve, they would have thought that Adam and Eve were black. So that was their world. But when John Speke went back, he made it sound like there were people who looked very much different from everyone else in Rwanda and did not belong to Rwanda. So that's when colonization did start happening. A lot of them came with a previously written knowledge from John Speke, and a lot of it was already creating this separation. And so when the colonialists did show up in Rwanda, a lot of what they did, they went on of what John Speke mentioned in his book, and also what other people who wrote after him had said. But this had nothing to do with what Rwandans had said. So when they did show up as colonialists, what happened is that they put people in these groups depending on how tall or how your nose was shaped, and you were given particular tasks depending on how you looked. And so obviously that all led to this separation of people, and people completely forgot that before the white man showed up, they all thought that they were Rwandans. This time they all became Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa. That's when ethnicities became a thing, and they started putting them in identification cards. And when this was introduced, this was around the 1930s, and so it was a lot of the people who were alive while the colonialists first arrived had already passed on. So the generation at that point, all they knew was that they were born either Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa. And basically that this was their norm, and they had forgotten what being Rwandan meant. Yeah. And basically after that, what happened is that the separation continued, and one group was favored by the colonialists. But in the 1950s, the group that had been favored, which was the Tutsi population, decided to figure out a way of getting independence because they wanted to bring back that Rwandan spirit. And, but this was not something that the Belgians were too happy about, because if we became a unified people again, the Belgians had no reason to stay and colonize us. So they tried to favor the other group that they hadn't favored previously, so that there would be riots and just instability in the country, because that way they would have had a reason to go to the UN and say, hey, we need to stay there. But this did not really stay for that long, because in 1962 we got our independence, which was a very suspicious event, to put it mildly, because we don't really have that kind of independence where we're like, oh, someone really fought for this. This was more of the UN says, hey, these people need independence, even though we hadn't really figured a lot of our things out. And the government that was put in place after that was driven a lot by that whole system that had been introduced by the colonialists, where they had this idea that a certain percentage of the population that looked more Caucasian, to put it, taller and straighter nose, did not come from Rwanda, so they were sort of deprived of that Rwandan national spirit, and so they had this intent of just taking them back to where they had come from. And so that went on up until 1994, where the Tutsi population was just deprived of a lot of things, and all this happening while the world is watching, and no one really made a comment on this. And to defend themselves, they used these books that Belgian priests had wrote, and just scholars from Europe had wrote, and they really had no facts to them, because they hadn't really taken into account the perspectives of the Africans that they had actually met in Africa. What they wrote was mostly from their own observation and their own perspective. So, and using those books, the government, the pre-genocide government, spread a lot of these propaganda that eventually led to people thinking that it was okay to exterminate the Tutsis. And unfortunately, in 1994, that happened, and more than 1 million people were killed because they were Tutsi, or they just thought that it wasn't fair that Tutsi should be exterminated. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think that was really insightful. And as most of you guys know, on April 7th, 2020, marked the 26th time that Rwanda is commemorating the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994. And I want you to explain to us why the idea of commemoration, or kwibuka in Kinyarwanda, is not only important for the Rwandans but for the entire world. Why should we do that?
Okay, so there are 3 main purposes of remembering. First, we remember for the victims. Secondly, we remember for the survivors. And thirdly, we remember for the next generation. And because after the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, the government that took over had this incredible task, because they were given a country where if you hadn't killed, you were a survivor, you know? Or if you hadn't just witnessed the killings, you were involved somehow with the killings, either on one side or on the other side, because there were really very few bystanders, you know? And so with the government trying to bring these people together, they had to make sure that with the unity and development and everything else, there was going to be a time where people could remember the people that had lost their lives. And that's when the first part of remembering comes in handy, which we remember the victims. So throughout the 100 days, starting April 7th through July 4th, we remember those who were killed systematically, because this was something that was planned and took a long time to plan, and a lot of money was put into the killing of the Tutsi. So we take the time to recognize that that actually happened. And since these were lives and these were people who actually lived on Earth, this is a time for us to bring them back and bring their memories back, and just recognize that they were there and tell the world that what happened was real and it wasn't something that we just made up. And when they died, it wasn't just because there were Africans killing each other. No, it was more like something that had been planned and something that had a historical background to it. And secondly, we remember for the survivors. So after the genocide against the Tutsi, the survivors gave Rwanda itself the greatest gift ever. They gave us the gift of their forgiveness, because without their forgiveness, we would not have the country that we do have today. I know my generation takes a lot of pride into what Rwanda is today, but if the survivors hadn't been willing to forgive the people who had killed their family members or just witnessed the killings of their family members, we wouldn't have them the life that we have. So we take this time to comfort them and to let them have this time to just talk about what happened to them, because there's power to just being able to talk about what happened. And then we take this time to allow them to just be embraced by the entire nation and the world as it has come, so that they see they're not alone into what happened. Because sometimes, you know, when you have seen something like that, or you've been in a hole for 3 months, it's easy for you to think that, oh man, I'm alone in this world and no one is ever going to be there to save me and nobody's ever going to understand what I went through. But we take this time to just be there for them and give them the space that they need to share what happened to them. And after that happens, we embrace them to let them know we can't really understand what you went through, but we're there for you and this will never happen again. And the third part is remembering for the next generation, because if we don't take the time to actually remember what happened in 1994, the next generation, meaning us and the generations after that, will never understand why it happened. So, because I know, especially if you're not from Rwanda and you witness it on TV, it's more like that idea that has come with colonialism, where if you see Africans fighting each other, it's like, oh, it's Africans fighting each other, you know. But during this time, as we're remembering, we're also getting the ideas back from our history, and we get to understand what caused it, so that we never get back into that whole cycle of killing our fellow Rwandans. Yeah. So those are the three main important pieces of remembering.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much. Now, I know the genocide against the Tutsi has been called a lot of names, absurd names like the Rwandan genocide, or addressing the commemoration like as the anniversary of the genocide against the Tutsi instead of saying the commemoration. Now, I want you to tell us why it's very important to call the genocide against the Tutsi by its proper name, which is genocide against the Tutsi, than using those other absurd names.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good question that I've been getting, especially during this time. So the main purpose of it is that the reason why people might not understand the importance of it, there are two reasons. One is that they're not aware of why it's important and what actually happened in Rwanda. They just know Rwanda and genocide together, so they call it the Rwandan genocide. And to those people, usually what I tell them is that even though the people who were killed in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi were Rwandan, for the longest time they were deprived of that Rwandanness. Just as I mentioned, through that colonialism, a major part of the country was deprived of their Rwandan spirit. So when they died, or when they were attacked, systematically attacked, they were attacked because they were Tutsi and not Rwandan. So for it to be called the Rwandan genocide, that would mean that it was an attack for being Rwandan. And that is not what happened, unfortunately, because one of the other groups was also Rwandan. And the group that was attacked at the moment was sort of deprived of being Rwandan. So it's important to address it that way, because otherwise we'd also address the Holocaust as, because I read this thing the other day of someone comparing to people who call the Rwandan genocide, then the genocide against the Tutsi, the Rwandan genocide, he compared them to people who would dare to say something like the genocide of the Jews and the Nazis, you know, because both were involved, but they were actually, the Nazis were the ones who attacked the Jews, which is why we call it the Holocaust and not the genocide of the Jews and the Nazis. So it's very important to think about these things, and once we put a name on it, people who are out there and trying to deny it are not given a platform. So that's the second part of people who might call it the Rwandan genocide. Unfortunately, politics is very dirty, and not just in Rwanda, but universally, politics will always be a dirty game, and a lot of people tend to use that genocide for their own political gains, and calling it Rwandan genocide, they have a lot of political benefits to it, which I am too young to understand, and I try not to get to it, because just politics in general makes me go depressed. So, but they use it for their own political gains. But if you're one of those people who just say Rwandan genocide because it's something, that's what you've heard, and well, just know from today on that it's not the Rwandan genocide, it's the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi.
Right. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to host you, and I think we gained a lot through his talks, and I'll see you next time in another episode where we're going to be talking about the post-genocide with another guest. And meanwhile, do not forget to subscribe, comment, and share this video. I'll see you next time.
We are actually acknowledging that more than 1 million lives that were lost in the genocide, that they actually existed and that they were part of this